Hello everybody, welcome back to Big Johnny D History. Today we're going to be doing a video by the channel Biographics on Horatio Nelson, Britain's most famous and favorite sailor. So the reason that we're doing this video today is because in our journey to finish Epic History series on the Napoleonic Wars, we are coming up on two videos that are very significant for Horatio Nelson, and that would be the Battle of Cape St. Vincent and the Battle of the Nile. And I know a little bit about Nelson's battles. Of course, I know about his most famous victory at Trafalgar, but I don't know all that much about Nelson outside of that. I know that he sunk Napoleon's fleet at the Battle of the Nile, so I figured before we get into Cape St. Vincent, which I have heard very much helps blossom Nelson's career, I wanted to learn a little bit about the man. So I know Biographics makes these quick videos that are very informative. They're documentary style and they use sliding pictures similar to Epic History, I would say, but obviously they're not a war-focused channel. And they provide great information. It's run by a gentleman named Simon, and he runs a multitude of channels, all of which are high quality. So I highly recommend you check them out. Link will be in the description. This isn't a sponsorship or anything for them, of course. I just think they make good content. And without further ado, let's learn about Horatio Nelson.
Being an island nation, you would figure that Great Britain would have its fair share of naval heroes. After all, the wooden walls of the Royal Navy protected the nation from invasion by various unfriendly continental neighbours for hundreds of years, and then projected British strength across a globe-spanning empire that the sun never set on. But if you asked who the greatest of Britain's naval heroes are, most people would give you the same answer. The humble son of an Anglican priest, Horatio Nelson rose to the rank of Vice Admiral while confounding and taking apart the French and Spanish navies sent against him, becoming one of the most famous men in the world in the process. He did everything he could do to encourage that fame, relishing in his own success, but he was also genuinely beloved by the people who knew him well, and particularly the sailors who served under him. His style of leadership is cited today in business and military leadership courses as being highly effective. Nelson's death only added to his legend, killed with almost the last bullet in the greatest naval battle of the age and one of the most famous in world history.
It's a shame that Nelson lost his life at Trafalgar because, like they mentioned, it was one of the last bullets of the battle. So it didn't really have to happen. Like Nelson being shot had no effect on the actual outcome of the battle. But what it did have an effect on was Nelson's legacy. Undoubtedly, regardless of if he lost his life at Trafalgar or not, he would have been remembered as one of the greatest British naval leaders, one of the greatest naval leaders, in world history in general. Like, it really would have been that's how significant the victory was. But because he passed away during it, because his life was taken, that solidifies him even further because it makes him have a hero's death, where he died defending this country and solidifying British naval power for over the next 100 years. So that's what is so fascinating about Nelson, because obviously Nelson has other major victories like the Battle of the Nile. I know that we have the Battle of Cape St. Vincent and many other naval victories, but he's most associated with Trafalgar. And no doubt that's because of how significant Trafalgar was, especially with Napoleon wanting to invade Britain. That's very appetizing to sink your teeth into. It seems interesting and it's very grand, and Nelson's death contributes. But you don't really hear people associate him with those other battles, at least people who are not history experts, people who are really into history like a lot of you guys watching.
Again, the Royal Navy had prevailed, frustrating the invasion plans of Napoleon and keeping British soil safe. But the death of Nelson at Trafalgar touched off a wave of national mourning that made people question if it was all worth it. But before we tell you about his death, let us tell you about his fascinating and complicated life. Horatio Nelson was born on September the 29th, 1758 in Norfolk, England. His father, Edmund, was the parish priest of the small village of Burnham Thorpe. His mother, Catherine's brother, Maurice Suckling, was a captain in the Royal Navy, and young Horatio seemed destined for a naval career from the start. In 1771, aged only 12, Nelson became a midshipman, reporting to the ship HMS Reasonable, captained by his uncle, to be trained as a naval officer. In those days, it was...
Okay, That's interesting. They said his father was a priest and he grew up in a small town. Really humble beginnings for Nelson. I figured he would have been from some famous family given his status, but Nelson actually seems to have come from very humble beginnings.
And for teenage boys to serve on Navy ships in the days before military academies, it was figured that the best teacher for would-be officers was first-hand experience. His early career was helped along by his uncle, who ensured that he was continually transferred to ships that were to see active service, so that Nelson rapidly gained more experience than his peers and was thus promoted quicker. In 1770,
I'm kind of noticing a few connections to Napoleon already because, kind of humble beginnings, not really somebody that you would see end up in the position that they were in. A little bit of family help. Nelson has his uncle who's helping him to gain more experience, putting him on active boats and active duty. And meanwhile, Napoleon's family was a minor nobility that was able to send him to military school in Paris. So noticing some parallels already, although Nelson is 11 years older. He is a little bit older than I thought at the time of his most famous victory.
He was promoted to lieutenant and was assigned to HMS Lowestoft, which was about to sail to Jamaica and to war. The rebellion of the 13 colonies of America had quickly blossomed into a worldwide war, with the entry of France and Spain into the conflict on the side of the Americans. The Caribbean, where ships from all four belligerents routinely sailed, was a hotbed of naval activity. Nelson spent the next 2 years taking prizes, capturing enemy ships, the value of which was awarded to the ship's crew as prize money, all the while being given more and more responsibility as his obvious talents became apparent. He was promoted to captain in 1779, and in early 1780, Nelson captured a Spanish-held fort on the San Juan River in Nicaragua, his first significant military achievement. His career was temporarily stalled when he was struck ill with malaria and was forced to return to Britain to recover. Nelson soon returned to active duty in command of the HMS Albemarle, which he commanded up and down the American coast until the war ended in an American victory in 1783.
So that's interesting. Nelson fought in the Revolutionary Wars, technically. And he had a lot more experience than I thought he did. Like I said, he's a little bit older than I thought, but this guy had 30 plus years of experience by the time you get to the Nile and Trafalgar and his most famous victories. So, man, yeah.
Nelson was sent to the Caribbean to act as a sort of policeman, seizing any American ships that attempted to trade with British colonial islands, which was illegal under the Navigation Acts. It was during this time that he met Frances Fanny Nesbitt, a widow who lived on a plantation on the island of Nevis. Nelson was smitten, and her uncle offered him a large dowry to marry her. It wasn't
Seems like another Napoleonic connection. I don't mean to drive so much connection to Napoleon, but he married a widow. Josephine was a widow. Her husband had his head chopped off in the French Revolution. So that's another interesting parallel. There is some parallels already.
After they were engaged, that Nelson discovered the dowry was a fiction. The family wasn't worth anywhere near as much as they had claimed. To make matters worse, Fanny had hidden the fact that she was infertile, incapable of having children, until after they were engaged.
Infertile of having children. Another Napoleonic connection. That is kind of crazy, the level of connection, considering that Nelson, in my opinion, would be Napoleon's greatest rival and nemesis, despite never actually meeting face to face on the battlefield. But all these parallels are very fascinating.
Off the engagement would have been dishonourable for an English gentleman, so Nelson had no choice but to go ahead with the wedding in 1787. The deception had soured the romance, however, and Nelson and Fanny would become more and more estranged as time passed. In 1788, Nelson was sent home to Britain, and for 5 years he languished on shore without a command. With no war to fight, there simply weren't enough ships to go round in the peacetime navy, and so Nelson was kept in reserve on half pay and had absolutely nothing to do but tend to his affairs at home while continually badgering anyone he knew for a command. He got his chance in late 1792 when the French revolutionary government, eager to flex its might to its neighbours, annexed the Austrian Netherlands, modern-day Belgium, which had traditionally been kept as a buffer state. state. The move heightened tensions between Britain and France, and in preparation for war, the Royal Navy called back its reserve officers, including Nelson, in January 1793. Soon after, France declared war, and Nelson's ship sailed to Gibraltar in May as part of a fleet determined to establish British naval supremacy in the Mediterranean. The flashpoint of the area was the French city of Toulon, which was held by French royalists but came under attack by the revolutionary Jacobins. The city appealed to the Royal Navy for help, but eventually a large Republican force occupied the hills around the city and began to bombard it into submission. The artillery officer in charge of the bombardment was a young man named Napoleon Bonaparte, and this was to be the start of his own military success story, though no one knew it at the time.
And it seems like nobody really knew it about Nelson either. The fact that Nelson was sitting at home for multiple years before getting back in and had to pester and basically annoy seniors to give him in places of command, you would not imagine that he would go on to be the most famous and highly regarded naval officer in perhaps world history.
Fell in December, and seeking a naval base close to the French coast, the fleet commander ordered Nelson to blockade the French-controlled island of Corsica, followed by an invasion in February 1794. After the army proved reluctant to proceed, Nelson himself was put in command of the land forces and helped capture the city of Bastia. He played an important role in...
They just said Nelson was leading the forces on a land invasion of Corsica in 1794. That's insane. Obviously, Napoleon is born in Ajaccio, Corsica, so, another Napoleon tie in there. He invaded Corsica. That's very interesting. And by this point, Napoleon wasn't on Corsica. Toulon had already happened. I believe Napoleon was Napoleon might have actually been in Corsica at that time. I think he did go back to Corsica after Toulon in the subsequent time before the Italian campaign. Obviously, he was in jail at that time. But anyway, we're getting sidetracked.
Operations for the remainder of the Corsican campaign, using cannons offloaded from naval ships to bombard enemy positions. On July the 12th, Nelson was wounded by debris from an artillery round that exploded near one of his batteries. The wound eventually cost him his sight in his right eye.
Nelson only had sight in one eye? That makes his victories impressive. This is going to be a little bit of a preview for Cape St. Vincent, which is going to be our next epic history video, the next video on the channel.
After the capture of Corsica, Nelson spent the next 3 years engaged in operations in the Mediterranean until French victories in Italy, at the head of an army commanded by Napoleon, forced the Royal Navy to leave their base in Corsica and sail to Gibraltar in December 1796. Nelson was on the way to join them on February the 1st, 1797, when, quite by accident, he happened upon the Spanish fleet that had left Cartagena and was headed south to the port of Cadiz to eventually link up with their French allies. Nelson's ship, unseen in the fog, escaped to alert the fleet commander, Admiral John Jervis, of the Spanish movements. Jervis decided to give battle, and on Valentine's Day, the two fleets met off of Cape St. Vincent. It was here that Nelson first distinguished himself in the eyes of the British public. In command of the HMS Captain, he engaged 3 much larger Spanish ships and captured 2 of them by boarding them and engaging in vicious hand-to-hand combat. The prize money from these 2 captured ships made Nelson rich, and his heroism at Cape St. Vincent had made him famous. He was now...
So check this out. Another battle where Nelson prevented the French from the Spanish from uniting their navies and earned major glory. Sounds familiar.
Horatio Nelson, having been made Knight of the Bath, and soon after the battle, he was promoted to Rear Admiral. One of the first things Admiral Nelson did after his promotion was to oversee a plan to capture the city of Santa Cruz de Tenerife in the Canary Islands, an important Spanish outpost and stopover point for the Spanish treasure fleets returning from the Americas. The plan called for a simultaneous bombardment and an amphibious landing. But after 2 aborted attempts to storm the beach on the night of July the 24th, 1797, Nelson decided to lead the troops ashore himself. The resulting battle was a disaster for the British. The Spanish defenders were well dug in, and they blasted the invading troops on the beach with cannon fire and musketry. No sooner had Nelson gone ashore than he was shot in the right arm and collapsed back into his boat. The musket ball had smashed his humerus bone into multiple pieces, and he was rowed back to his flagship to be attended to by...
Dude, Nelson's a badass. This guy's a naval admiral. and he leads a ground assault and gets shot in the arm doing it. He's a certifiable badass.
Surgeon. Medicine at the time period was barely out of the Dark Ages. Germ theory was still decades away, and the most common way to prevent a wounded limb from getting gangrene and killing the victim was to amputate it. Most of Nelson's right arm was sliced off and thrown overboard.
Nelson only had one arm?
British
That's
force
insane.
didn't fare much better. When they withdrew the next day, 250 had been killed and another 128 wounded. Nelson was despondent both over the failure to capture Santa Cruz and by the loss of his arm. He wrote to
So he did the Battle of the Nile in Trafalgar with one arm and sight and only one eye. Man.
commanding admiral of the Mediterranean fleet that he intended to return home to England and retire, as, in his words, a left-handed admiral will never again be considered useful.
How ironic. How ironic. He would end up being the most useful man in Britain.
Nelson remained in England for several months recuperating, but in March 1798 he went to sea again, having been convinced that the Royal Navy had use for a one-armed admiral after all, and that retirement didn't really suit him anyway. He returned to the Mediterranean, where he was given a squadron of 15 ships and ordered to Toulon to intercept a French fleet that was on the move. In France, Napoleon Bonaparte had become the most important political and military figure in the country. His strategy for 1798 was to invade Egypt with a large army and navy, and thus bring pressure to British-occupied India. This was in the hope that it would threaten her commercial interests and force Great Britain to abandon the war. Napoleon got away from Nelson after the British ships were blown off course by a storm, but the British soon pursued them across the Mediterranean to Alexandria.
And Nelson almost caught Napoleon before he got to Alexandria. Napoleon ended up taking a route that was more south. Napoleon wanted to leave quickly because he knew that the British Navy would be looking for him. So he left quickly, and there was a bunch of fog one time when Napoleon's fleet was going to pass Nelson's fleet, and I believe they got within a mile of each other, and they didn't see him due to the fog. So Napoleon narrowly avoided Nelson. And there was another moment where Nelson thought that they were going to land in Alexandria. He lands in Alexandria, then leaves because the French didn't show up. And then the French show up less than a day after Nelson leaves Alexandria. So Nelson almost caught the French immediately.
The French army had already won a series of victories against the ruling Mamluks, and the French fleet was anchored off the coast of Alexandria in a delta of the Nile River in a supposedly impregnable defensive position. But Nelson was unimpressed and moved immediately to attack. As dusk fell on August the 1st, the British ships fell upon the stationary French ships. The French admiral, de Broise, had figured that the shoals on the flanks of his battle line would prevent the British from getting onto his starboard right side and thus surrounding him, so all of his sailors were ordered to man the port left side cannons. But Nelson's lead ships found a gap in the shoals, and suddenly the French found themselves under attack from both sides. Darkness fell, but the scene was illuminated by the battle raging in the Nile Delta. Cannons belched out flames from all sides and started several fires, including one that engulfed the French flagship L'Orient. This exploded when the flames reached the gunpowder magazine, killing Admiral de Broise. Admiral Nelson was wounded for the third time in his career, a flesh wound that he quickly had bandaged, and then he returned to oversee the battle. Overwhelmed by the amount of British cannons brought to bear on them, the French ships...
I wonder, if anybody can let me know in the comments, how was Nelson wounded in the Battle of the Nile that would be considered a flesh wound? Because this guy's already been wounded pretty terribly, so for him to return to the battle, it must have not been that bad, but if he's going to come back to the Navy after losing an arm and sight in one of his eyes... This dude could have been shot in the belly and then just came back to the battle. Obviously, I'm being hyperbolic, but somebody let me know in the comments below what the injury was, if you know.
Surrender as dawn broke on August the 2nd. The battle was, for all intents and purposes, over. The French fleet was completely destroyed. Out of 17 ships that began the battle, 4 were burned and 9 were captured. The French suffered 3,500 casualties to the British 900. The battle had great strategic consequences for the...
Nelson, just like Napoleon, when he's in battle, over 3 times the casualties for the French than his force. And that's what a great leader does, inflicts these high casualties while protecting his men, not just, winning a clubbing match. It actually is tactics and skill and better training upon the men.
It trapped Napoleon's army in Egypt, forcing the general to return to France without his troops. He never trusted the navy again, and this mistrust would weigh heavily in his future military decisions. Great Britain, meanwhile, had gained complete dominance of the seas around the conflict zone, an advantage they'd hold for the rest of the war. Nelson's victory at the Battle of the Nile made him a national hero. Heads of state from all over Europe sent him accolades, and he revelled in the attention. For all his many virtues, Nelson was rather vain and a shameless self-promoter. For instance, when, shortly after word reached London of his
You know who else was a shameless self-promoter? A French man by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte. Just more parallels being drawn between Nelson and Napoleon.
he was given the title Baron Nelson of the Nile, and Nelson was insulted that he was only given a mere baronry instead of a more prestigious title. Shortly after the Battle of the Nile, Nelson sailed to Naples to refit his squadron. He was feted by the Neapolitan royal court and was a guest of British ambassador Sir William Hamilton. Nelson had briefly met Sir William and his wife Emma in 1793, but he was a far different man now. He was scarred, he was blind in one eye, missing an arm, and internationally renowned. Emma Hamilton was 35 years younger than her husband and was considered one of the most beautiful and intelligent women of her day. During Nelson's stay in Naples, he and Emma fell deeply in love with each other and soon were carrying on an affair that the entire world seemed to know about. The strange part was that not only was it apparent that Sir William was aware of his wife's affair with Nelson, but he was surprisingly open-minded about it, considering the time he lived in. The three lived together in Naples and
We have a 200-year cuck. We have a 17th century cuck, or 19th century cuck. Yeah, wow, that's rather fascinating.
when Hamilton was recalled home to England, Nelson returned as well, and the three set up together at a house in London, much to the fury of Nelson's wife Fanny. Around Christmas 1800, Fanny gave her husband an ultimatum to choose Emma or her, and, well, Nelson chose his mistress. The two never lived together again.
Wow. So once again, I'm sorry to keep pointing it out, but they're just all over the place. We have another Napoleon connection with eventually divorcing his wife, partly due to infertility, likely, and remarrying, just like Napoleon did. And the affair. Napoleon had affairs as well. So did Josephine, though. So, you know, the more you know.
On January 1st, 1801, Nelson was promoted to Vice Admiral and was sent on a new assignment to the Baltic Sea. Denmark, tired of Britain blockading her ports to stop French trade, had allied itself with Prussia, Sweden, and Russia in order to break the blockade of the Royal Navy. Nelson was sent as part of a fleet to break up this League of Armed Neutrality that threatened British naval supremacy in Europe. Nelson
And the League of Armed Neutrality, in premise, is a really good idea, and there's nothing wrong with that. They didn't like that Britain and France were forcing them in a position where they had to choose a side. And a lot of the countries that traded with France, Britain would either seize the goods or blow up the ships, so they formed a League of Armed Neutrality. Britain said, nah. So they went and attacked Copenhagen, which is what we're going to hear about here.
His superior, Admiral Parker, to allow him to take a dozen ships of the line into Copenhagen harbour and attack the Danish fleet before they had time to join up with the Swedish and Russian fleets. Nelson attacked on April 2nd. The battle didn't start out well for the British. 3 ships ran aground early in the battle, prompting Admiral Parker to signal the retreat. But Nelson, who had a better grasp of the situation than Parker did, decided to continue the attack. In a bit of his trademark wit, he held up his telescope to his blind eye and said, "I honestly can't see the signal." The battle turned in favour of the British as they destroyed 3 Danish ships and captured and burned a dozen more. Nelson called for a truce, which the Danes accepted. The destruction of the Danish fleet, together with the sudden death of Tsar Peter I of Russia, marked the end of the League, and Nelson returned home to receive more accolades. He was now...
Nelson is a certified badass. Imagine you're gazing into battle, and you're about to, embark on an epic opportunity to prove yourself even further. At this point, Nelson's already the certified legend after the Nile and Cape St. Vincent and his previous victories. But you're sitting here and, you have this opportunity to further prove yourself. You hold up a telescope to your blind eye and you crack a joke to the men and you go in and you dominate. What a man.
Viscount Nelson of the Nile and considered the country's foremost naval hero. In October 1801, Great Britain and France signalled the Peace of Amiens, ending the war. Nelson spent the next 2 years in Britain, living with William and Emma Hamilton and touring the country with them. Emma had given birth to a daughter, Horatia, that everyone knew was Nelson's illegitimate daughter, and
I wonder how they knew that it was Horatio Nelson's daughter. How would they ever know that Horatia was Horatio Nelson's daughter? I don't know. I don't really see a connection between Horatia and Horatio. I don't know.
Conventional family all lived together at a country estate in Surrey until Sir William died in April 1803. A month later, war again broke out and Nelson was back at sea. Nelson was appointed commander of the Mediterranean Fleet and given the pride of the Royal Navy, HMS Victory, as his flagship. His orders were to blockade Toulon, where the French Navy, under the command of Admiral Pierre-Charles Villeneuve, was at anchor. It was essential to keep the French ships from escaping the blockade and moving north to the English Channel, where they could help Napoleon, now Emperor of the French, invade Great Britain. For 2 years, Nelson and Villeneuve played a cat-and-mouse game with each other, a series of back-and-forth maneuvers that saw Nelson at one point chase Villeneuve all the way across the Atlantic to the West Indies, and then back again. In August 1805, Nelson returned briefly to England on leave. He was cheered.
You know, it's debatable that if Nelson, because obviously this was, the French and the Spanish wanted their fleets to meet up in support for an eventual ground invasion that Napoleon attempted to do to Britain. It's debatable that even if Nelson lost the Battle of Trafalgar, or let's say the Battle of Trafalgar did not happen, let's say the two naval forces didn't meet, it's debatable that if Napoleon launched a ground invasion, it would have been successful either way. I posed this question on one of my previous videos discussing Napoleon. Somehow this came up. And we had this debate in the comments. Like, there was a few people on either side in the comments below. So if you guys have any thoughts on that, leave it in the comments below. I'm curious to hear more opinions. But personally, in my opinion, I don't think that Napoleon's ground invasion of Britain was ever going to work, even if Trafalgar was a stalemate or if the battle didn't happen and the Royal Navy came later. I think it would have been a lot more difficult than Napoleon anticipated to get those troops across, because the French, they didn't have all that many fantastic naval leaders. All of them, at least the ones that we see in these major situations, are all fairly incompetent. So I don't think it would have made much of a difference, but I'm curious to know what everybody else thinks.
Where he went, much to his delight. In September, word came the Allied French and Spanish fleets had combined together at the Spanish port of Cadiz. Nelson knew it was time to return to sea. He departed on board Victory on September the 14th after saying goodbye to his beloved Emma. Nelson arrived at Cadiz on September the 27th and spent most of the next month preparing for the battle he was sure was to come. Meanwhile, his French counterpart, Villeneuve, was feeling the heat from Napoleon. The Emperor was angry that his admiral wouldn't engage the British fleet and break out of the blockade at Cadiz. He sent a replacement overland to Cadiz to take command of the fleet. Villeneuve, in an effort to stave off the humiliation of being relieved of command, decided to sail out before his replacement arrived. On October the 20th...
Wow, I did not know that. Villeneuve sailed out because he was going to be replaced by Napoleon. And that's when he ended up running into Nelson with Trafalgar. What a fate, what a butterfly effect that him being released was gonna do.
33 ships of the Franco-Spanish fleet sailed out of Cadiz and were spotted by British scout frigates who quickly moved to inform Nelson. On October the 21st, Nelson moved his 27 ships to engage the enemy off the coast of Cape Trafalgar. At 11:45, he prepared to engage. He ordered a signalman to signal the rest of the ships in the fleet. England expects that every man will do his duty. A great cheer went up throughout.
Just a simple quote, but one that sends shock and awe into your troops. British expects every man will do his glory. This is business as usual. Let's take care of this. Let's go home. Job well done.
Fleet. Nelson was truly beloved by the men he commanded. In a time when naval officers were expected to be strict disciplinarians to the point of cruelty towards the common sailor, Nelson garnered respect with affection and kindness. Nelson.
Once again, we're seeing another parallel between him and Napoleon, and this is what makes a great leader of this age, and really of any age. It's not about treating your men like machines. You have to actually treat them like men. They have feelings, they have thoughts, they have to be respected, they have to be well paid, and most importantly, they have to respect you. So when you can earn the respect of your men, and we could see why a man like Nelson would have the respect of his men based on what we're seeing. He's extremely accomplished. He risks his own life. He gets wounded. This man has accomplished everything there is to accomplish. So when you have the respect of your men, that's what creates a phenomenal leader rather than just a great one. One that can make men achieve glories that they would never otherwise achieve under a different leader.
Battle plan was simple. He meant to close with the Franco-Spanish fleet as quickly as possible, cut their battle line into 3 pieces, and engage the enemy in ship-to-ship combat, which he was sure he would be victorious at due to the superior training of his gunnery crews. He split his force into 2 squadrons, one led by himself aboard Victory, and the other led by his second-in-command, Admiral Collingwood, aboard the Royal Sovereign. With a little wind to speed their progress, the British ships slowly moved towards the Allied line, all while under fire from the French and Spanish ships. Finally, after almost an hour, Victory passed between 2 French ships and fired a devastating broadside. Other ships followed, and a general melee ensued. Victory found herself engaging the French ship Redoubtable. The French crew had largely abandoned their cannons and were massing on deck to try and board the Admiral's flagship until they were cut apart by the cannon fire of a passing British ship. All the while, a murderous fire poured down from the Redoutable's mast and rigging from sailors stationed up there with muskets. Nelson had forbidden his captains from doing this, worried about the sails catching on fire. Thus, unhampered, the French sharpshooters.
Just a little smart thing to think about. If you're firing bullets on top of the sail, maybe, perhaps, you hit the sail. Nelson was smart enough to think that through. French, unfortunately for themselves, were not.
Picked their targets at will, and Nelson, standing on the quarterdeck in his distinctive uniform, made for a perfect target. At around 1 p.m., an hour into the battle, Nelson was shot, the bullet entering through his shoulder blade and severing his spinal cord. The Admiral collapsed to the deck, recognizing immediately that the wound was fatal. He was carried below deck and made comfortable, as there was nothing that the doctor could do for him. Nelson lived long enough to hear that yet another spectacular victory was his. The French and Spanish had lost 22 ships. The British had lost none. Thank God I have done my...
The French and the Spanish lost 22 ships, and the British lost none. And they were the attacking force. The French were here, and they were just firing upon the British as they made this slow, creeping approach. And the British lost no ships. That is insane. We are going to rewind a few seconds here. We're at a critical moment.
The British had lost 22 ships. The British had lost none. Thank God I have done my duty, Nelson said. The Admiral died at 4:30 at the age of 47.
A man all about glory. Even in his last moments, just thank God that I have done my duty. He knew that, he was very assured in what he was doing and ultimately accomplished it.
There was no celebration of the victory at the Battle of Trafalgar. Instead, the death of Admiral Nelson touched off a period of profound national mourning in Great Britain that wouldn't be seen again until the death of Princess Diana nearly 200 years later. Nelson's body was returned to England and given a state funeral at St. Paul's Cathedral.
What a beautiful painting of this scene, just pointing that out there. Although, I'm a little bit confused why I'm seeing French flags. Maybe somebody can let me know. Is St. Paul Cathedral in France? I would imagine it's not. I'm seeing Spanish and French flags.
London. Thousands of people...
Oh, they just said it was in... Sorry, maybe I should let them talk.
The funeral route and packed the pews of the cathedral to say goodbye to their hero. One person not in attendance, however, was Emma Hamilton. Nelson had neglected to amend his will to include Emma and Horatio, and although he begged the country to take care of them before he died, Nelson's brother, who inherited most of his estate, was completely uninterested in helping her. The British public may have been willing to overlook Nelson's affair because of his status as a national hero, but after his death, Emma was branded an adulterer and was shunned by her former friends. She died in 1815 at the age of 49, deeply in debt and suffering from a number of health problems. Her daughter with...
Wow, that's very, very sad to hear.
Horatio lived a quiet life as a reverend's wife and raised 10 children, living until 1881.
Okay, well, at least Nelson's bloodline was allowed to continue. She had 10 children. Seems like a lot, but they had a lot of children in the age. Especially in the era of mass warfare that they were in, you could have 14 kids and let's say 10 of them were boys and all of them lose their life in combat. It happens. And then a lot of early born deaths and you had to have a lot of kids then.
Had so many places and things named after him that it would be impossible to list them all. The most famous of these is Trafalgar Square in London, one of the most popular tourist attractions in the city. Located prominently in the square is a 145-foot, 44-metre granite column topped with a statue of the man who will likely forever be known as Britain's most beloved sailor. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please.
That was really great. Shout out to Biographics for an awesome video. I think their presentation is very well done. They get their information across quickly, touching upon the main points of someone's life, so that way you can get an idea of who somebody is without having to watch a multi-hour documentary. And I love multi-hour documentaries, don't get me wrong. But when it's something that, let's say you don't have the time for it, these types of videos are fantastic. I learned a lot about Horatio Nelson. Let me know what you thought the most interesting thing about Nelson was, or something you would like me to know in the comments below. Let me know if you have any sort of challenges or debates to anything that I say. I love the history debates and history talk. It's why I do this. History is one of my biggest passions. It's very, very... Ever since I started learning about history, I don't watch TV shows the same anymore, because history is real. There's no plot holes in history, and that's why I like it. But without further ado, we're going to close this out. I hope you all enjoyed today's video. I will see you all in the next one. Hit like and subscribe if you did, and the bell as well. Peace out.